The grand ballroom of the Elysian Hotel was not so much a room as it was a captured glacier. Light from a dozen crystal chandeliers fractured across the cavernous space, glinting off polished marble floors that gleamed like frozen rivers. The air itself felt expensive, filtered and chilled, carrying the faint, sterile scent of money and the fainter, warmer scent of orchids flown in from a continent away. It was a silence bought and paid for, a quiet so profound it felt heavier than noise. In the center of this opulent tundra, sitting like a polished black stone on a field of white snow, was a Bosendorfer Imperial Concert grand piano. Its lid was propped open, revealing a pristine row of ivory and ebony keys that seemed to hold their breath, waiting for a touch worthy of their silent promise. Julian Croft surveyed this kingdom of ice from his throne, a plush velvet armchair in a secluded corner. He was a man sculpted from currency, his suit a dark slash of bespoke tailoring that cost more than the car the new valet probably drove. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe watch did not simply tell time, it declared his victory over it. His face was a mask of handsome indifference, but behind his eyes, a ledger was always being tallied. He saw the world not in colors or emotions, but in assets and liabilities. The people around him were figures on a balance sheet, their worth calculated with a swift, merciless glance. His own thoughts were a low hum of contempt, a constant dismissal of a world he had long ago conquered and now found dreadfully boring. Wealth had not brought him warmth. It had encased him in a sheath of perfect, unbreakable cold. Moving through this arctic expanse like a ghost was a young man named Leo. He was a member of the event staff, practically invisible in his simple black uniform. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows and the collar, but it was immaculately clean, a testament to a dignity that had nothing to do with price tags. His shoes, though scuffed, were polished to a soft gleam. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his steps making no sound on the marble, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. But within him, behind eyes that held a sorrow too deep for his years, was a world of profound richness. It was a world of memory and loss, a private symphony of grief for a sister whose laughter he could still hear in the quietest moments. That loss had led him here, to this place of hollow splendor, forcing him to serve men who possessed everything and valued nothing. The object of focus, the grand piano, pulled at Leo's gaze whenever he passed. He saw not an instrument, but a vessel of memory. He could almost feel the smooth, cool kiss of the keys under his fingertips, a sensation tied inextricably to a time before his life had fractured. It was a phantom limb, an ache for a part of his soul he had amputated years ago. He allowed himself only a fleeting glance, a moment's indulgence before turning away. To linger was to invite attention, and attention in a world like this was a liability he could not afford. Julian noticed the boy's glance. He noticed everything. It was a flicker of longing, a momentary crack in the servant's impassive facade. The sight irritated him, like a smudge on a perfectly clean window. What right did a boy like that have to look upon such an instrument, with anything but detached servitude? It was an object of art, a symbol of a rarefied world the boy could never hope to enter. The boy was scenery, a functional part of the hotel's machinery. And machinery was not meant to have desires. The irritation festered inside Julian, a tiny, bitter seed. He was bored. The conversations around him were predictable, the sycophantic laughter grating. He needed a diversion, a small act of power to remind himself that he was alive, that he was in control. His gaze drifted from the piano, through the grand glass doors, to the circular driveway where his car, a custom Rolls-Royce Phantom, sat like a panther carved from obsidian. Its tires were immaculate, but in Julian's mind, he pictured a speck of dust, a tiny imperfection on his perfect world. An idea, cruel and sharp as a shard of glass, formed in his mind. It was perfect. It would be a small, private drama for his own amusement. He waited. He watched Leo complete his task of replacing champagne flutes on a nearby table. Then, with the casual authority of a king summoning a courtier, he gestured. "You," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. It was a voice of ice wrapped in velvet. Leo approached, his back straight, his eyes fixed on a point just over Julian's shoulder. "Sir?" Julian allowed a smile to touch his lips. It was a smile as thin as a paper cut. "Come with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply rose and walked toward the grand entrance, confident the boy would follow. To Julian, this was not a request. It was a transaction. He was the customer, the boy was the service, and the service would be rendered. They stepped out into the cool evening air. The city lights glittered below them like a carpet of scattered diamonds. Julian's Rolls-Royce waited under the portico, its black paint drinking the light. Its sheer presence a declaration of untouchable power. A small crowd of guests milled about, waiting for their own cars, their chatter a low murmur against the city's hum. Julian stopped beside the front passenger side wheel. He ran a gloved finger over the gleaming chrome of the hubcap and then inspected it. He pretended to find a microscopic fleck of dirt. He turned to Leo, his expression one of profound disappointment. "This is unacceptable," Julian stated, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. The murmur of conversation began to die down as people turned to watch. Leo looked from Julian's glove to the tire. It was spotless. He understood immediately that this was not about cleanliness. This was about something else entirely. "I'm sorry, sir. I can call the valet service to give it another polish." Julian laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. It was the sound of a lock clicking shut. "No, that won't be necessary. You will clean it." He let the words hang in the air. The crowd was now silent, watching. Julian felt a thrill, the familiar surge of control. He was the director of this little play, and everyone was his captive audience. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip. The metal was cold and heavy, a solid block of gold. He peeled off a single $100 bill, then paused. He put it back, and with deliberate slowness, pulled out a crumpled, single-dollar bill instead. He held it out between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something distasteful. "I need this tire to be perfect," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more public than a shout. He looked directly into Leo's eyes. "I want you to get on your knees and wipe it clean, with your sleeve." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Some looked away in embarrassment. Others watched with a kind of horrified fascination. No one moved. No one spoke up. Julian's power was an invisible wall, and they were all trapped behind it with Leo. Then, Julian did something that tipped the act from mere arrogance into pure cruelty. He leaned forward and spat, a small, deliberate glob of saliva that landed squarely on the shining black rubber of the tire. "Clean my tires!" he spat again, this time with words. The command was absolute, stripped of any pretense of civility. He tossed the single-dollar bill onto the ground beside the tire. It fluttered there, a pathetic insult. Leo stood frozen. The world seemed to shrink to the space between him and the defiled tire. Humiliation washed over him, hot and suffocating. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, dissecting him, pitying him, scorning him. He thought of his sister, of her unwavering belief in his worth, in the dignity of his spirit. He felt her memory recoiling from this moment. For an instant, he considered walking away, just turning his back and disappearing into the night, leaving the job, the hotel, and this cold, cruel man behind. But then another thought surfaced, forged in the quiet resilience he had cultivated over years of hardship. Running away was a surrender. It was an admission that this man, with his money and his contempt, had the power to break him. And Leo would not be broken. He looked at Julian, his gaze no longer averted. For the first time, he looked directly into the billionaire's cold, gray eyes. And in that moment, Julian saw something he did not expect. It wasn't fear or anger. It was a profound, unshakable calm. It was the stillness of a deep ocean beneath a raging storm. Slowly, with a grace that seemed utterly out of place, Leo knelt. The crowd held its breath. Julian's thin smile widened. He had won. But Leo did not reach for his sleeve. Instead, he simply knelt there for a moment, his head bowed, as if in prayer. Then he looked up at Julian Croft. "No," he said. The word was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence with the force of a thunderclap. He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees with a steady hand. He did not look at the dollar on the ground. He looked only at Julian. Just then, a new figure emerged from the hotel. It was Eleanor Vance, the hotel's owner, a woman whose quiet influence dwarfed even Julian's bombastic wealth. She was an elegant, silver-haired woman with eyes that missed nothing. She had seen the entire exchange from the doorway. She walked directly to Leo, ignoring Julian completely, and placed a gentle hand on the young man's arm. "Leo," she said, her voice warm with a kindness that felt like a physical shield. "Are you all right?" Then she did something that sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd and through Julian Croft himself. She pulled the young man into a gentle, motherly hug. It was an act of profound, public solidarity. Julian stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. The owner of the most exclusive hotel in the city, a titan of industry and society, was hugging the boy he had just tried to humiliate. It didn't make sense. The ledger in his mind was malfunctioning. Ms. Vance released Leo and turned to face Julian. Her expression was no longer kind. It was as cold and hard as diamond. "Julian," she said, her voice dangerously low, "we need to talk, inside." She gestured toward the ballroom, and the crowd, sensing the shift in power, parted like the Red Sea. Julian felt a prickle of unease. He was not used to being summoned, but there was a finality in her tone he knew he could not ignore. He followed her back into the glacial ballroom, leaving a stunned crowd and a single crumpled dollar bill on the pavement behind him. Leo followed a few steps behind, his quiet dignity now amplified into something that felt like power. Back inside the silent, cavernous ballroom, the air crackled with unspoken tension. Mrs. Vance led them not to a private office, but to the center of the room, stopping right beside the magnificent Bösendorfer. The piano stood as a silent witness, its polished surface reflecting the three figures in distorted shapes. Julian's arrogance began to reassert itself, a reflex against the unfamiliar feeling of being challenged. "Eleanor, whatever that was outside was a private matter. The boy was insubordinate." Ms. Vance turned to him, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Insubordinate?" Julian, I saw what you did. You spat on a tire and ordered a young man to clean it for $1. That isn't discipline. That is a sickness." Julian scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "He's a member of the staff. He gets paid to serve." He was looking at things above his station. The piano, my car. I was simply reminding him of his place. A strange, sad smile touched Miss Vance's lips. "His place," she repeated softly. She turned her gaze to Leo, who stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back. Then she looked back at Julian. "You see this young man, and you see a uniform, a functionary, a nobody. You are blind, Julian, utterly and tragically blind." The theatricality of it all began to grate on Julian. He felt his control slipping. "And what am I supposedly not seeing? Is he your secret nephew? Some charity case you've taken under your wing?" The insult landed with no effect. Ms. Vance's gaze drifted to the piano. "You know, Julian, you always prided yourself on being a patron of the arts. You donate to the symphony, you have a box at the opera, but you don't love art. You love owning it. You see that piano as a status symbol worth $500,000. She paused, letting her words sink in. Leo sees it as a voice. Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A voice? What is this, a poem? The boy parks cars and clears tables. What would he know about a Bosendorfer?" The challenge was laid. The trap was set. Julian, in his arrogance, had walked right into it. Ms. Vance's voice became sharp, more than you could ever imagine. She turned to Leo, her expression softening. "Leo, would you?" It was not a command. It was a gentle invitation, an opening of a door. Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second. The piano was a place of ghosts for him, a sacred ground of memory and pain. To play in front of this man, the man who had just tried to strip him of his dignity, felt like a violation. But then he looked at Ms. Vance's encouraging face, and he understood. This was not for Julian. This was for him. This was taking back the part of his soul he had buried. With a quiet nod, he walked to the piano. The movement was fluid, natural. He pulled out the bench, the scrape of its legs on the marble the only sound in the vast room. He sat, his posture perfect, his back straight. He didn't look at the keys. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness, he saw his sister's smiling face. "Play for me, Leo. Play." Julian watched, a smirk playing on his lips. This was becoming more ridiculous by the second. He crossed his arms, ready to witness the clumsy, embarrassing plinking of a few notes, a child's rendition of chopsticks. He would savor the moment, the vindication of his judgment. Then, Leo placed his hands on the keyboard, and the world fell away. The first notes that emerged were not clumsy. They were not hesitant. They were notes of crystalline purity, falling into the silence like raindrops onto a still lake. It was Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, the posthumous, but it was played with a depth of feeling, a profound and sorrowful beauty that went beyond mere technical skill. The music filled the cavernous ballroom, not with noise but with emotion. It spoke of loss, of longing, of a beauty that persists even in the deepest grief. Leo's fingers didn't just press the keys. They danced with them, caressed them, bled onto them. His body swayed with the music, a vessel entirely given over to the sound he was creating. The piano, which had been a silent, expensive object, was alive. It was weeping. It was singing. It was telling a story. Julian's smirk vanished. His arms uncrossed. He stood frozen, his mind unable to reconcile the boy he had spat at with the artist who was now holding the entire room, the entire world, captive. The music was a physical force, bypassing his intellect, his arrogance, his walls of ice, and striking directly at something deep inside him. A part of him he had thought long dead, because he knew this piece. His late wife, Amelia, had loved this nocturne. She had played it herself, not with this godlike skill, but with a simple, heartfelt passion. She said it was the sound of a soul reaching for something it had lost. Hearing it now, played with such heartbreaking perfection by this boy, was like hearing her ghost whisper in his ear. The cold sheath around his heart began to crack. The music swelled, a torrent of complex, cascading notes played with an impossible combination of power and delicacy. It was no longer just a performance. It was a revelation. It was the sound of a hidden king revealing his crown. The few remaining staff in the hall had stopped what they were doing, standing mesmerized. The security guards at the door were still, their faces etched with awe. The power dynamic in the room didn't just flip, it was annihilated. Julian Croft, the billionaire, the titan, the master of the universe, was now just a man, small and insignificant, standing in the shadow of a genius. Leo, the boy in the worn uniform, was a giant. He was the source of the sublime, the channel for something divine. The $500,000 piano was worthless without him. The entire billion-dollar hotel was just a shell for the music he was making. As the final lingering notes of the nocturne faded into the silence, the absence of sound was more profound than the music itself. No one moved. No one breathed. Leo kept his hands on the keys for a long moment, then slowly let them fall to his lap. He opened his eyes, which seemed to hold the echo of the entire piece. He did not look at Julian. He looked at Ms. Vance, a silent question in his eyes. Julian stood, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. The ledger in his mind had been burned. The numbers were all gone. All that was left was the phantom sound of a melody and a pain so sharp and sudden it stole his breath. He felt like he had been running his whole life, only to crash headfirst into a wall he never knew was there. The silence was finally broken by a single person clapping. A man stepped forward from the shadows near the entrance. He was older, with a mane of white hair and an impeccably tailored suit that spoke of old-world European elegance. Julian recognized him instantly. It was Antoine Dubois, the most feared and respected music critic in the world. A single word from him could make or break a career. Dubois walked slowly toward the piano, his eyes fixed on Leo with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. He ignored Julian and Ms. Vance completely. Incredible, Dubois breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He stopped a few feet from the piano. Young man, where did you study? At Juilliard? The Curtis Institute? With whom? Leo looked down at his hands. Nowhere, sir. My sister taught me, a long time ago. Dubois shook his head in disbelief. Self-taught? Impossible. That is not technique. That is a gift from God. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the room before finally landing on Julian, his eyes narrowing with contempt. Some of us spend our lives searching for a sound like that. We attend concerts in Vienna, in Moscow, in New York, hoping for a single moment of true transcendence. And tonight, it was here, in this room, being asked to clean tires. The critic's words were like hammer blows, each one landing with devastating precision. He was quantifying the scale of Julian's error, not in dollars, but in something far more valuable, cultural and artistic significance. Do you have any idea what you just heard? Dubois demanded of Julian, his voice rising. That was not a hotel employee playing a tune. That was the heir to Horowitz. That was the continuation of the legacy of Rubinstein. That talent is priceless. It is a natural resource, a treasure. And you treated it like dirt. Julian had no response. He was stripped bare, his armor of wealth and power rendered utterly useless. The world he understood, the world of numbers and deals and leverage, had been replaced by a world of intangible value, where he was bankrupt. Just then, Julian's phone began to vibrate incessantly in his pocket. He ignored it. Then another phone, belonging to a junior executive who had been loitering nervously by the bar, began to ring. The executive answered it, his face paling as he listened. He scurried over to Julian, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Croft." "Sir, there's a video." "What video?" Julian asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "From outside. Someone filmed it. The incident with the tire. They filmed all of it, and someone else inside filmed the boy playing the piano. They've been edited together. Sir, it's everywhere. It's going viral. The title is The Billionaire and the Janitor Genius." Julian felt a wave of cold dread wash over him, a coldness that had nothing to do with his wealth. This was the cold of ruin. His reputation, the carefully constructed edifice of power and infallibility he had built over decades, was being dismantled in minutes by a cell phone video. His phone vibrated again. He pulled it out. The screen was a cascade of notifications, missed calls from his board members, frantic texts from his PR chief, news alerts with his name in the headline. His company's stock ticker was visible in one notification, accompanied by a sharp, downward-pointing red arrow. The public fallout had begun. The machinery of his own world was turning against him. Miss Vance watched him, her expression unreadable. "It seems your little drama has found a wider audience, Julian." She then gestured to the two large security guards who had been standing by the door. They approached, their faces grim. They did not look at Julian with the deference he was accustomed to. They looked at him as if he were a problem to be managed. "Mr. Croft," one of them said, his voice polite but firm, "Ms. Vance has asked that we escort you to her private office, now." Being escorted, by security, in a hotel he practically owned a piece of. The humiliation was absolute. It was a complete inversion of the scene he had orchestrated not 20 minutes earlier. Then, he had been the one wielding power, backed by an audience. Now, he was the one being publicly removed. His power evaporated. He looked at Leo, who was still sitting at the piano, looking small and overwhelmed. He looked at the critic, Dubois, who was now speaking to Leo in low, urgent tones, a look of discovery on his face. He looked at Ms. Vance, who stood as the arbiter of his fate. Stripped of his usual defenses, Julian Croft felt a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion. It was the feeling of being utterly and completely alone. He had no one to call, no deal to make, no threat to issue that could fix this. He had built a fortress of money to protect himself from the world, but he had just discovered that the most devastating attacks come from within. The melody of the nocturne still echoed in his ears, a beautiful, terrible sound that was tearing his fortress down, brick by brick. Wordlessly, he turned and allowed the guards to lead him away, a fallen king being led from his own corrupted court. Eleanor Vance's private office was the antithesis of the grand ballroom. It was warm and intimate, filled with books, art, and personal photographs. It was a room that valued memory over marble. Julian stood in the center of the room, feeling like a trespasser. The security guards had left, closing the door softly behind them, but their presence lingered, a reminder of his new, diminished status. Leo was there too, standing quietly by the window, looking out at the city lights. He had been asked to come, and he had complied without a word. Ms. Vance sat behind her large mahogany desk, but she didn't assume a position of power. She simply gestured for Julian to sit in one of the comfortable leather armchairs opposite her. He did so mechanically. His body felt heavy, disconnected from his mind. "My board has already convened an emergency meeting," Julian said, his voice flat. He was trying to revert to his default setting, business, damage control. "They're invoking the morals clause in my contract. They want my resignation." "And they will have it," Ms. Vance said. It was not a question. "What you did tonight was not just a personal failing, Julian. It was a betrayal of every value this establishment, and frankly, any decent human being is supposed to represent. But that is a business problem. We are here to discuss a human one." She looked from Julian to Leo, then back again. "I want you to tell me why, Julian. Not a press release, not a legal statement. The truth. Why such cruelty?" Julian stared at his hands, at the ridiculously expensive watch that now felt like a shackle. The truth. He wasn't sure he knew what that was anymore. For years, the truth had been whatever he decided it should be. But the music had shattered that certainty. "I don't know," he mumbled. It was the most honest thing he had said in 20 years. "Try," she pressed, her voice firm but not unkind. A dam inside Julian, weakened by the music and cracked by the public humiliation, finally broke. The words came out in a torrent, a confession not just of this night's sins, but of a lifetime of them. "I grew up with nothing," he began, his voice raspy. "Not humble, not working class. Nothing. We lived in a one-room apartment that always smelled of boiled cabbage and failure. My father, he was a kind man, a good man, and the world broke him. I watched him be polite and deferential to men who were half as smart and a tenth as decent, just because they had money. I watched him shrink every day, and I swore I would never be him. I would never be broken." He looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading light. "So I fought. I clawed my way out. I learned the language of power, which is money. Money is a shield. It's armor. If you have enough of it, no one can touch you. No one can make you feel small. I stopped being a person and became a fortress. I thought it was strength." His gaze fell. "Amelia, my wife. She was the only one who ever saw through it. She knew the frightened boy I was hiding inside. She loved that boy. She wasn't impressed by the fortress. She loved the garden that was supposed to be growing inside. But I kept reinforcing the walls. I thought I was protecting us." Tears, hot and unfamiliar, began to well in his eyes. He did not wipe them away. When she died, the garden died with her. All that was left was the fortress, cold, empty, and impenetrable. The cruelty, it wasn't for fun. It was maintenance. It was me checking the walls, making sure they were still high enough, still strong enough to keep everyone out, to keep the memory of that helpless little boy out. When I saw him, he gestured vaguely toward Leo. I saw weakness. I saw my father, and I had to crush it, because I was terrified that if I didn't, it would crush me. The room was silent, filled only with the sound of Julian's ragged breathing. He had stripped himself bare, revealing the wounded, terrified core he had spent a lifetime concealing. Mrs. Vance listened with a deep, somber attention. After a long moment, she turned her gentle gaze to Leo. "Leo," she said softly, I think it's time you told him your story. Leo turned from the window. His face was pale, and his eyes held a universe of old pain. He had heard Julian's confession, and it had not softened him with pity, but steeled him with a strange, tragic sense of purpose. He walked and stood before Julian's chair, forcing the broken billionaire to look up at him. "I wasn't always a valet, Mr. Croft," Leo began, his voice steady and clear. "I was going to be a concert pianist. I had a scholarship to the most prestigious conservatory in the country waiting for me. I had a future." He paused, the memory a heavy weight. "I had an older sister. Her name was Amelia." Julian's head snapped up. A jolt, like an electric shock, went through him. The name. That name. It couldn't be. She was my biggest fan," Leo continued, his voice trembling slightly for the first time. "She was the one who scraped together enough money to buy our first broken-down upright piano. She worked 2 jobs so I could have lessons. She believed in me more than I believed in myself. The piece I played tonight, Chopin's Nocturne, that was her favorite. She made me promise I would play it at my debut at Carnegie Hall." Leo's eyes locked onto Julian's. "But we never got there. 10 years ago, the night I received my scholarship letter, we were walking home, celebrating. A car, a dark, expensive car. It came out of nowhere. Speeding. It hit her." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The room started to spin. "No. No." "The driver didn't stop," Leo said, his voice now a hollow echo of his grief. "He just kept going. Left her on the side of the road. She died in my arms. After that, the music died too. I couldn't touch a piano. The sound was the sound of her absence. The scholarship expired. Our family fell apart under the weight of it all. I took jobs like this one to survive, to disappear." The fated connection, the terrible, ironic twist of destiny, hung in the air between them, a blade poised to fall. Julian was shaking his head, a silent, desperate plea for it not to be true. What was her full name?" Julian whispered, the words barely audible. "Amelia," Leo said, his voice breaking. "Her name was Amelia Vance." Ms. Vance, who had been silent, let out a soft, choked sob. The name confirmed everything. Julian stared at Leo, at the face that now held a faint, ghostly echo of his late wife's features. Amelia Vance. The sister Leo had lost was the woman Julian had married. The boy he had humiliated was the brother of the one person he had ever truly loved. But the horror was not yet complete. There was one more piece. "The accident," Julian choked out. "The hit and run. That killed my Amelia. It was before we were married. I spent years, a fortune, trying to find the person who did it. The police never found a lead." A new, more terrible understanding dawned in Leo's eyes. "You mean, you weren't the one driving that car?" For one insane moment, both men had suspected the other of the ultimate sin, but reality was both simpler and more cosmically cruel. They were not perpetrator and victim. They were 2 mourners, grieving the same soul, unknowingly bound together by the same tragedy for a decade. Julian had not just insulted a stranger. He had desecrated the living memory of his wife. He had spat on the brother she had adored, the one whose talent she had nurtured, the one whose future was the last great hope she had spoken of before her life was stolen. The fortress Julian had built did not just crumble. It was revealed to have been a tomb all along, and he had just spat on the grave of the one person buried there. He let out a sound that was not a word, a raw, guttural cry of anguish that came from the very bottom of his shattered soul. He collapsed forward, his head in his hands, and wept. He wept for his wife, for the boy he had wronged, and for the man he had become, a man his Amelia would no longer recognize. Leo watched him, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something other than pain or anger. It was a profound, aching pity. They were not enemies. They were partners in the same unbearable loss, two halves of a broken heart that had finally, tragically, found each other. In the days that followed, Julian Croft ceased to exist. The man the world knew, the arrogant CEO, the titan of finance, vanished. He resigned from his company, transferred his voting shares into a blind trust, and disappeared from public life. The viral video became a footnote, a story of a disgraced billionaire who had simply imploded. The world, with its short memory, moved on. But the man, Julian, remained. He was a ghost, haunting the empty rooms of his cavernous mansion, a space that now felt less like a palace and more like a mausoleum. The silence was no longer a luxury. It was a punishment, filled with the phantom notes of a Chopin nocturne and the memory of a young man's face, a face that was a mirror of his lost love. He was stripped of his power, his reputation, his armor. All that was left was the pain and the crushing, unbearable weight of his actions. For a week, he did nothing. He was adrift in a sea of regret. He could sell everything, move to a private island, and live out his days in obscurity. He could let the ruin consume him. It was the easy path. It was the coward's path. It was the path his father might have taken. But then, another memory surfaced. It was Amelia's voice, not her favorite music, but her words. "It's not the falling that defines us, Julian. It's the getting back up. It's what we choose to build from the rubble." He had fallen. He was surrounded by rubble. Now, he had a choice. Wallow in it or build something. He made a call. Not to a lawyer or a banker, but to Eleanor Vance. 2 days later, he was sitting in that same warm, book-lined office. This time, he was the one who had requested the meeting. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater. The imperious posture was gone, replaced by a humble slump. The coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "I want to do something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Something real. Not for PR, not for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. For her. For Amelia." Ms. Vance listened, her expression neutral. "I'm liquidating the majority of my assets," Julian continued. "Billions of dollars. I want to create a foundation, a charitable trust. I want to call it the Amelia Vance Foundation for Young Artists." He slid a folder across the desk. It was filled with preliminary legal documents and mission statements. Its purpose will be to find gifted young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds, children who have the talent but not the means. It will provide them with instruments, world-class instruction, scholarships, everything they need. Everything Leo's sister tried to give him. It will be a legacy of creation, not destruction. Ms. Vance looked through the documents. The scale of it was staggering. It was not a token gesture. It was a complete reallocation of one of the world's great fortunes. It was an act of profound, radical atonement. "This is a monumental undertaking, Julian," she said, her voice filled with a hint of awe. "It's the only thing that makes sense," he replied. "But it's not enough. A foundation is just money and paperwork. It needs a soul. It needs a leader who understands its mission not as a concept, but as a life lived." He took a deep breath. This was the hardest part. "I want Leo to run it." Ms. Vance looked at him, surprised. "Leo? Julian, He's a musician, not an administrator. And after what you did— I know, Julian interrupted. I have no right to ask him for anything, but he has to be the one. He is the Foundation's moral compass. He is its purpose made flesh. I don't want him to be an employee. I want him to be its president. The charter will give him complete, irrevocable control. My only role will be to ensure it is funded, in perpetuity. Then I will step away. Completely. It was an act of ultimate empowerment for the young man he had tried to debase. It was handing over the keys to his entire legacy. It was a condition he was setting on himself, a final, necessary act of relinquishing control. He will have the power, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. The power to create opportunities, not to humiliate. The power to build futures, not to destroy them. It's the power I had and misused. He will know what to do with it. Miss Vance was silent for a long time, her eyes searching Julian's face. She saw no deceit, no hidden angle. She saw only a broken man desperately trying to build something beautiful from the wreckage of his life. I will arrange a meeting, she said finally. I will present your offer to him. But the choice, Julian, will be his and his alone. The meeting took place a week later, not in an office but in the empty ballroom, beside the silent Bösendorfer. Leo had agreed to listen, nothing more. He stood with his arms crossed, a shield against the man who had inflicted so much pain. Julian did not try to apologize. Words were meaningless now. He simply laid out the plan, the foundation, the vast resources, and the final, staggering offer of complete control. When he was finished, the silence returned, thick and heavy. Leo walked over to the piano and traced a single, silent key. He thought of his sister. He thought of the years of bitterness and grief, the music that had died inside him. Julian's money could not bring her back. It could not erase the pain. But then he thought of other children, other Leos with sisters like Amelia, who were fighting for a chance. He thought of the talent being lost to poverty, to tragedy, to a world that saw them as functions, not as souls. This foundation, it could be a shield for them. It could be the hand up that he and his sister never had. It could turn his personal tragedy into a source of hope for thousands. It would not be accepting a gift from Julian Croft. It would be taking the weapon Julian had used for destruction and reforging it into a tool of creation. It would be the ultimate vindication. He turned from the piano to face Julian. I have one condition, Leo said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. Julian nodded, ready to agree to anything. Anything. You will not step away, Leo said. You will not disappear. You will serve on the board. You will have no vote. You will have no power. Your job will be to listen. You will attend every recital. You will meet every child we help. You will bear witness to the good that is done in her name. That will be your penance. And your redemption. Julian stared at him, stunned. He had offered to disappear, to remove his toxic presence entirely. But Leo was offering him something far more difficult and far more profound. A path back to humanity. A long, arduous, and humbling path. Tears streamed down Julian's face, but this time, they were not tears of anguish. They were tears of a terrible, painful, cleansing grace. I accept, he whispered. 3 years passed. The Amelia Vance Foundation for Young Artists became a beacon in the world of music and philanthropy. It was a sprawling, vibrant organization that had already changed the lives of hundreds of children, unearthing prodigious talents from forgotten corners of the country. Its success was rooted in its authenticity, in its deep understanding of the artists it served. At its head was Leo Vance. He was no longer the invisible boy in the worn uniform. He was a respected leader, a mentor, and a visionary. He rarely performed in public, finding more joy in fostering the talents of others. But when he did, concert halls sold out in minutes. He had found his purpose not on the stage at Carnegie Hall, but in building 1,000 other stages for those who came after him. He had found peace. A grand gala was being held in the very same ballroom of the Elysian Hotel where the story had begun. The room was still opulent, but tonight it was not cold. It was filled with the warmth of chatter, of laughter, and most of all, with music played by the Foundation's first graduating class of scholars. The air, once sterile, was alive with hope. Leo stood at a podium on a low stage, the Bösendorfer gleaming behind him. He looked out at the sea of faces, donors, mentors, proud parents, and the bright-eyed young musicians themselves. He began to speak, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the rapt audience. "We measure success in many ways," he began. "In scholarships granted, in competitions won, in concertos mastered. But the true measure of this foundation, the currency that truly matters, is not found in our balance sheets. It is found in the courage of a young girl from a coal mining town who picks up a violin for the first time. It is found in the dedication of a boy from a crowded inner city who practices piano 8 hours a day because it is the only language that makes him feel heard." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This foundation is named for my sister, Amelia. She believed that talent was universal, but opportunity was not. She believed that within every person, no matter their station, resided a spirit of immense worth, a beautiful and unique music. Our mission is simply to give that music a voice." In the back of the room, standing near the entrance, was Julian Croft. He wore a simple, dark suit, no different from dozens of other guests. There was no watch on his wrist. He was no longer the center of any universe. He was simply a man, humbled and changed, his face etched with a permanent, quiet sorrow that was now mingled with a profound sense of peace. He was a witness, just as Leo had commanded. He attended every event, listened to every student, and saw in every one of their triumphs a small piece of the beautiful thing he had almost destroyed. His work on the board was silent, administrative, and deeply meaningful. Leo's eyes found Julian's across the crowded room. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked. There was no accusation, no lingering anger. There was only a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the long, painful road they had traveled together. It was a moment of silent, mutual forgiveness. Leo concluded his speech. "My sister used to say that the most beautiful music comes from instruments that have known a bit of damage, that have been broken and lovingly repaired. Their resonance is deeper. I believe the same is true of people. Our true wealth is not our immunity to pain, but our ability to connect through it. It's measured in the second chances we are brave enough to give and humble enough to receive." The room erupted in applause. Leo stepped away from the podium and sat down at the piano. He began to play. It was not the sorrowful Chopin nocturne. It was a simple, hopeful melody, a piece full of light and warmth. It was a new song, a song of redemption. As the music filled the room, Julian Croft smiled, a real, genuine smile. It was the first one in over a decade. He understood now. True worth was not in owning the piano. It was in having a reason to hear the music. He had lost a kingdom of ice, but he had, at long last, found a small measure of warmth. And in the shared memory of Amelia, in the legacy they were building, he had found a connection, a fortune more valuable than any he had ever amassed.